Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time, to a world where the line between dream and reality was as thin as morning fog over the Aegean Sea. Tonight, we journey together into a moment that belongs not to ancient kings or distant empires, but to our own age, a moment when the entire world held its breath, when the rhythm of human civilization stumbled and nearly stopped, when 7 billion souls found themselves facing an invisible enemy that respected no borders, acknowledged no power, and moved with the silent certainty of fate itself. This is the story of the 100 days when the world went silent, though in truth, the silence stretched longer, and its echoes will resonate through generations yet unborn. It is the story of early 2020, when a virus emerged from the shadows of possibility into the harsh light of reality, transforming within mere weeks from a distant rumor to a force that would reshape every aspect of human existence. But more than that, it is a story about us, about how we respond when the unthinkable becomes undeniable, about the fragility of the systems we take for granted, about the courage and fear that live side by side in the human heart. Imagine, if you will, the world as it was in those final days of innocence, in the waning moments of 2019. Picture the great cities of Earth, New York with its rivers of yellow taxis and crowds surging through canyons of steel and glass, Tokyo with its neon brilliance and ordered chaos, Mumbai with its ancient soul wrapped in modern urgency, London with its layered history breathing through every cobblestone. The airports hummed with constant motion, metal birds carrying humanity's restless energy across oceans and continents. The restaurants overflowed with laughter and clinking glasses. The theaters and concert halls pulsed with gathered humanity, strangers sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories and songs. The schools echoed with children's voices, that particular music of youth that seems to promise the world will always turn toward tomorrow. And beneath it all, invisible and unsuspected, something was stirring. In the city of Wuhan, in China's Hubei province, where the Yangtze River flows wide and ancient, where history stretches back thousands of years through dynasties and revolutions, physicians began noticing something unusual in late December. Patients were arriving at hospitals with pneumonia-like symptoms that didn't quite fit the familiar patterns. The illness was severe, affecting the lungs with particular ferocity, and it seemed to be spreading in clusters, entire families falling ill, healthcare workers becoming infected, a pattern that suggested something was passing from person to person with disturbing efficiency. The city itself was preparing for Chinese New Year, that great annual migration when hundreds of millions of people travel to reunite with family, when trains and planes and buses carry the longing for home across the vast expanse of China. Wuhan, a city of 11 million souls, stood at the crossroads of these journeys, a transportation hub where countless lives intersected daily. The markets were busy with preparations. Stalls overflowing with fresh vegetables and fish, merchants calling out their wares, the particular energy that comes before a great celebration when everyone is thinking about reunion and renewal. But in the hospitals, a different kind of preparation was beginning. Dr. Li Wenliang, an ophthalmologist, sent a message to his medical school alumni group on December 30th, warning them about a cluster of cases that reminded him of SARS, that terrifying virus that had emerged in 2003, spreading fear across Asia before being contained. He urged his colleagues to take precautions, to protect themselves and their families. It was an act of professional concern, the kind of informal warning that medical professionals share when they sense something unusual stirring in their patients. He could not have known that his private message would be shared widely, or that local authorities would summon him and require him to sign a statement accusing him of spreading false rumors and disturbing public order. He could not have known that he himself would contract the virus while treating patients, or that he would die from it on February 7th, becoming one of the early martyrs of a pandemic that would claim millions. His death would spark an outpouring of grief and anger across China and the world, transforming him into a symbol of the importance of allowing medical professionals to speak truth even when that truth is uncomfortable. Through January, the situation in Wuhan evolved with the terrible logic of exponential growth. At first, the numbers seemed manageable, dozens of cases, then hundreds. But those who understood infectious disease recognized the pattern. Each infected person was spreading the virus to others, and those others were spreading it further, creating branching chains of transmission that grew like the roots of an enormous tree spreading through soil. The disease had a name now, COVID-19, short for Coronavirus Disease 2019. And the virus that caused it was labeled SARS-CoV-2, reflecting its relationship to the SARS virus that had caused such alarm nearly 2 decades earlier. On January 23, in a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks before, the Chinese government locked down Wuhan. Imagine the enormity of that choice, a city larger than London or New York, home to millions of people, suddenly sealed off from the rest of the world. No one could leave. Transportation stopped. Businesses closed. The streets emptied as if a switch had been thrown, transforming a bustling metropolis into something resembling a city from a science fiction story, where the inhabitants have vanished and only the buildings remain as testimony to human presence. The images that emerged from Wuhan during those weeks carried a strange, haunting quality. Deserted streets stretching empty beneath streetlights. Apartment buildings rising against the sky with only a few lit windows, each one a small island of life in an ocean of stillness. Workers in hazmat suits spraying disinfectant across surfaces as if they could wash away the invisible threat. Makeshift hospitals being constructed at stunning speed, entire facilities rising in a matter of days to handle the overwhelming flood of patients. And the sounds, or rather, the absence of sound. The silence of a city that should have been celebrating its most important holiday, that should have been filled with fireworks and family gatherings and the joyful noise of millions of people marking the turn of the lunar year. Instead, silence. A silence punctuated only by ambulance sirens and the mechanical sounds of construction and the occasional cry carried on the wind. But Wuhan's sacrifice, for that is what it was, a sacrifice imposed on millions in an attempt to protect billions, could not prevent what had already begun. The virus had escaped the city before the lockdown, carried by travelers who didn't yet know they were infected, spreading through the complex web of modern transportation with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. By late January, cases were appearing across China and beginning to emerge in other countries: Thailand, Japan, South Korea, the United States, France. The World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th. The phrase seemed almost bureaucratic, the language of international institutions trying to sound the alarm without causing panic. But for those paying attention, the message was clear: something unprecedented was unfolding, something that would require coordinated global response, something that threatened to overwhelm the healthcare systems and social structures that we had built over generations. And still, in much of the world, life continued largely as before. It was easy to see COVID-19 as someone else's problem, as something happening over there, in distant Wuhan, in faraway China. The psychological distance matched the geographical distance. We are remarkably skilled at believing that catastrophe will visit others but not ourselves, that the impossible will remain impossible, that tomorrow will resemble yesterday because that is what our experience teaches us to expect. February brought the first major outbreaks beyond China's borders. The Diamond Princess cruise ship became a floating laboratory for how the virus spread in confined spaces. Quarantined in Yokohama Harbor, the ship's passengers and crew watched as the infection count climbed day by day, dozens, then hundreds, then more than 700 confirmed cases among the roughly 3,700 people aboard. The ship became a symbol of our vulnerability, a reminder that our technologies and systems, our massive vessels that were meant to provide luxury and leisure, could become prisons and incubators for disease. In Italy, the virus found purchase in the Lombardy region, in the prosperous north where Milan stands as a monument to Italian style and industry. The first cases appeared in small towns near Bergamo and Lodi, spreading through social networks, a youth soccer team, a hospital emergency room, a bar where friends gathered in the evening. By late February, Italian authorities were racing to establish red zones, cordoning off towns and then entire provinces as the infection numbers climbed with sickening speed. The Italian outbreak was particularly significant because it shattered certain comforting assumptions that had taken hold in some quarters. Italy was not China, it was a wealthy European democracy with an advanced healthcare system, a member of the G7, a nation with all the resources and capabilities that modernity could provide. If the virus could overwhelm Italian hospitals, if it could force Italian physicians to make terrible choices about which patients would receive scarce ventilators and which would be left to struggle for breath without mechanical assistance, then it could happen anywhere. Dr. Daniele Maccini, working in a Bergamo hospital, posted a Facebook message in early March that captured the apocalyptic reality unfolding in northern Italy. He described the hospital as a war zone, with every department transformed into a COVID ward, with patients arriving in such numbers that makeshift areas had to be created to handle them all. He wrote of colleagues falling ill, of the psychological toll of seeing so much suffering, of the surreal quality of treating an endless stream of patients with the same disease. His words carried the shell-shocked tone of someone witnessing something that should not be possible, that violated every assumption about how the world was supposed to work. The images from Italy became seared into global consciousness. Military trucks in Bergamo, lined up in the darkness, carrying coffins because the crematorium could not keep pace with the dead. Hospital hallways filled with beds because the designated wards had overflowed. Healthcare workers with their faces marked by protective equipment, their eyes revealing exhaustion that went beyond the physical into something existential. A nation famous for its love of life and beauty and human connection, suddenly alone and afraid and watching its elderly die in numbers that recalled the darkest chapters of history. By early March, the virus was spreading across Europe with the inevitability of weather. Spain reported its first cases, then saw them multiply rapidly, particularly in Madrid. France watched as the infection moved through Paris and beyond. Germany prepared for impact. The United Kingdom debated its response, initially flirting with the concept of herd immunity, the idea that allowing the virus to spread through much of the population would eventually create enough resistance to stop transmission, before recognizing that this approach would result in catastrophic casualties. And in the United States, the response was marked by a fatal combination of political division, institutional failure, and a cultural resistance to collective action that would prove devastatingly costly. The first confirmed case arrived in Washington state in late January, a man who had traveled from Wuhan and had the good sense to seek testing when he developed symptoms. But the virus was almost certainly already circulating undetected, spreading through communities in Washington and California and New York, moving from person to person through the ordinary interactions of daily life, invisible and patient and inexorable. The testing situation in the United States was particularly problematic. The CDC had developed its own test, but initial versions were flawed, and regulatory barriers prevented other laboratories from developing and deploying their own tests. Through crucial weeks in February, when South Korea was testing tens of thousands of people per day and building a detailed picture of the outbreak, the United States remained largely blind, testing only a few hundred people per day, unable to see the storm that was building. Washington state's outbreak centered initially on a nursing home in Kirkland, where the virus moved through the elderly population with horrifying efficiency. These were people who had lived through World War II and the Depression, who had survived polio and the Cold War, who had accumulated decades of memories and relationships and wisdom. And now they were dying alone, isolated from their families by necessary infection control measures, passing from life to death with only masked healthcare workers as witnesses, their last moments marked by struggle for breath and separation from everything they loved. By mid-March, it was clear that the virus was not going to be contained through testing and contact tracing alone. The spread was too widespread, the chains of transmission too numerous and tangled. Nations began making the difficult decision to implement lockdowns, to ask or require their populations to stay home, to close businesses and schools, to restrict movement and gathering in ways that peacetime democracies had never attempted before. March 11th brought a cascade of announcements that marked the true beginning of the global pause. The World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic. The NBA suspended its season after a player tested positive just before tip-off, the stunned crowd in Oklahoma City watching in confusion as the game they had come to see was suddenly canceled. Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson announced they had tested positive while in Australia, bringing the virus into the realm of celebrity and somehow making it more real for many people. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by nearly 10%, the worst single-day drop since the 1987 crash. And then came the lockdowns, rolling across the world like a wave, as one nation after another concluded that there was no other choice. Italy had already locked down by this point. Spain followed. France announced a strict confinement. The United Kingdom, after its brief dalliance with herd immunity, reversed course and ordered people to stay home. In the United States, the response was fragmented because the authority was fragmented, with states making their own decisions in the absence of clear federal direction. California was among the first, with Governor Gavin Newsom issuing a statewide stay-at-home order on March 19th. New York followed on March 22nd, with Governor Andrew Cuomo appearing daily in briefings that became appointment television for anxious residents trying to understand what was happening. Within days, most of the country was under some form of lockdown, with only essential workers allowed to continue their regular activities. The essential workers, how that phrase took on new meaning in those days. We had always known abstractly that certain jobs were critical to maintaining civilization, but the pandemic made it visceral and specific. The grocery store workers who showed up day after day, facing potential exposure so that the rest of us could eat. The nurses and doctors and respiratory therapists working impossible hours under terrifying conditions, watching patients die despite their best efforts, going home each night wondering if they were carrying the virus to their own families. The sanitation workers collecting garbage because waste does not stop accumulating just because the world has paused. The truckers moving supplies across continents. The pharmacy workers filling prescriptions. The delivery drivers who became our connection to the world beyond our doors. These workers were disproportionately people of color, immigrants, those who had always been at the margins of economic security. The pandemic revealed and amplified existing inequalities, showing with brutal clarity that our society was structured in ways that left some people protected and others exposed, some with the luxury of staying home and others with no choice but to risk infection to survive economically. The experience of lockdown itself varied enormously depending on circumstance. For those privileged enough to have comfortable homes, secure incomes, and the ability to work remotely, it was certainly disruptive and often lonely, but it was manageable. They could order groceries delivered, could maintain their employment through video conferences, could wait out the crisis in relative safety and comfort. But for those in small apartments with multiple generations crowded together, for those whose jobs disappeared overnight with no safety net, for those in abusive relationships suddenly trapped with their abusers, for those experiencing homelessness with no shelter from the virus, the lockdown was something far darker. The pandemic did not create these inequalities, but it illuminated them with pitiless clarity, making visible the fault lines in our social structure that we had been content to ignore when times were easier. The empty cities became one of the pandemic's most powerful and haunting images. Times Square in New York, that symbol of human energy and commercial excess, standing silent and nearly deserted, the illuminated billboards advertising to no one. The Las Vegas Strip, that monument to American excess and spectacle, its casinos dark and its sidewalks empty. The Thames Embankment in London, where tourists would normally crowd to photograph Big Ben and Parliament, stretching vacant beneath grey skies. The boulevards of Paris, the piazzas of Rome, the shopping streets of Tokyo, all emptied of the human presence that gave them meaning and purpose. There were moments of eerie beauty in these scenes. Deer wandering through the streets of Japanese cities. Dolphins visible in the canals of Venice. The Himalayas visible from northern India for the first time in decades because the pollution had cleared. Nature reasserting itself in the spaces we had claimed, reminding us that we were visitors here, that the world did not require our presence to turn. But beneath the surface beauty was profound disruption and suffering. The unemployment numbers were staggering. In the United States alone, over 20 million jobs lost in April, the fastest and deepest collapse in employment in recorded history. Small businesses that represented generations of family effort closed their doors, many never to reopen. Artists and musicians and actors found their livelihoods vanished overnight as theaters and concert halls went dark. The restaurant industry, which had provided employment and gathering places and cultural identity for communities, collapsed as dining rooms were forced to close. The educational disruption was equally profound. Schools around the world closed, affecting over 1.5 billion students. Teachers scrambled to move their instruction online, discovering in real time what worked and what didn't, trying to maintain connections with students who were dealing with their own trauma and disruption. Many students thrived in the online environment, but many others fell behind, particularly those without reliable internet access or quiet spaces to learn, those dealing with food insecurity or unstable housing, those with learning differences that required in-person support. For younger children, the loss was particularly poignant. Kindergartners who never got to experience the full joy of that first year of school, the playgrounds, and craft projects and story time on the carpet. High school seniors who watched their final year dissolve into pixels and isolation. No prom or graduation ceremony or those last precious weeks with friends before they scattered to colleges and careers. College students sent home from dorms, missing the independence and community and coming-of-age experiences that are as much the purpose of university as the formal education. The healthcare system faced an unprecedented crisis. It wasn't just the number of patients, though that was overwhelming in hard-hit areas. It was the nature of the disease, the way it attacked the lungs, requiring intensive respiratory support, the need for negative pressure rooms and careful infection control, the reality that healthcare workers were at high risk of infection themselves. Hospitals in New York City, in northern Italy, in Madrid, in other hotspots became scenes from disaster films, patients on ventilators filling every available bed, hallways converted to treatment areas, refrigerated trucks serving as temporary morgues because the existing capacity was overwhelmed. The PPE shortage, personal protective equipment, became a defining crisis. Healthcare workers were rationing N95 masks, wearing the same mask for days when it should have been changed between patients, fashioning makeshift protection from office supplies and garbage bags. The images of nurses wearing plastic trash bags as gowns, of doctors reusing single-use equipment, of healthcare professionals posting desperate pleas for donations of masks and gloves, these became symbols of the system's failure to prepare for a crisis that experts had been warning about for decades. And the dying. So much dying. By the time we reach the end of this story, the global death toll will be measured in millions, but even a single death is a universe of grief. Each person who died was someone's parent or child, someone's partner or friend, someone with a lifetime of accumulated memories and relationships and unrealized dreams. They died in ways that violated our deepest assumptions about how death should occur, alone in hospital rooms, unable to be comforted by family, their last moments witnessed only by exhausted healthcare workers in hazmat suits. The inability to properly mourn was one of the cruelest aspects of the pandemic. Funerals were forbidden or severely limited, no gathering to share memories, no physical comfort in the form of hugs and held hands, no rituals that had helped humans process grief since the beginning of our species. People died and were buried or cremated in small ceremonies or no ceremonies at all, their passing marked only by grief carried in isolation by those who loved them. April brought spring to the northern hemisphere, but it was a spring drained of its usual symbolism of renewal and hope. The weather warmed, flowers bloomed, trees leafed out, but humanity remained largely indoors, watching the season change through windows. There was something deeply unnatural about that disconnect, the world outside continuing its cycles while human activity remained suspended, as if we had been placed on pause while the earth kept turning. The death toll climbed day by day, the numbers becoming almost abstract in their enormity. New York City alone lost more than 20,000 people in April and May. The city that never sleeps fell into an exhausted, traumatized quiet, broken only by the nightly 7 o'clock applause for healthcare workers, that brief moment when people leaned out windows or stepped onto balconies to clap and cheer and bang pots and pans, a small gesture of solidarity and gratitude that acknowledged the impossible burden being carried by those on the front lines. The economic pain deepened as the lockdowns continued. Small businesses burned through their reserves, tried to pivot to delivery or online sales, applied for emergency government aid that was often slow to arrive or ran out before reaching them. Landlords and tenants negotiated impossible situations. How do you pay rent when your income has vanished? How do you forego rent when that rental income is your own livelihood? Eviction moratoriums provided temporary protection but left the underlying problem unresolved, creating a wave of housing insecurity that would crest months later. The response from governments varied wildly. Some nations provided generous income support, ensuring that people could stay home without facing destitution. Denmark's policy of covering 90% of salaries allowed businesses to retain employees without bankruptcies. New Zealand's decisive early lockdown combined with strong social support limited both deaths and economic damage. Other nations left people to fend for themselves or provided minimal assistance that ran out quickly, forcing impossible choices between safety and survival. In the United States, the response was characteristically contradictory and complex. The CARES Act provided enhanced unemployment benefits and one-time stimulus payments, offering a temporary cushion for many families. The Paycheck Protection Program aimed to help small businesses retain workers, though its implementation was chaotic and many businesses reported that the funds arrived too late or were inadequate. The Federal Reserve took unprecedented action to support financial markets, but that support flowed primarily to those with investments rather than those living paycheck to paycheck. The scientific community mobilized with impressive speed and creativity. Labs around the world sequenced the virus's genome within weeks of its emergence, sharing the information openly to accelerate research. Clinical trials began for existing antiviral drugs that might prove effective against COVID-19. Researchers studied the virus's biology, how it infected cells, why some people developed severe disease while others showed no symptoms, what interventions might help patients recover. And the vaccine efforts began, representing humanity's best hope for ending the pandemic. Traditional vaccine development takes years, sometimes decades. But this was not a traditional situation, and unprecedented resources and attention flooded into vaccine research. Multiple approaches were tried simultaneously: traditional vaccines using inactivated virus, viral vector vaccines, and the novel mRNA technology that had been under development for years but had never been deployed at scale for infectious disease. The social fabric strained in complex ways during these months of isolation. Mental health deteriorated for many people, particularly those living alone or those with pre-existing conditions like depression or anxiety. Domestic violence increased as victims found themselves trapped with their abusers. Substance use disorders worsened for those in recovery who suddenly lost their support networks and in-person treatment. Suicide hotlines saw increased call volumes from people struggling with isolation, economic stress, and the pervasive uncertainty about when life might return to something resembling normal. Yet there were also moments of surprising connection and creativity. People sang from their balconies in Italy, creating impromptu concerts that united neighborhoods. Teachers drove through their students' neighborhoods in parades so children could see their faces and wave. Neighbors left supplies on each other's doorsteps, checking in on elderly residents, creating informal mutual aid networks. Artists created virtually, musicians live-streamed concerts, theater companies performed over video conference, finding ways to maintain human connection even when physical proximity was forbidden. The technology that enabled remote work and learning and socializing became simultaneously a blessing and a curse. Video conferencing platforms saw their usage explode, becoming the primary interface for work meetings, family gatherings, social connections, even religious services and therapy sessions. But screen fatigue was real, the cognitive load of processing multiple faces in little boxes, the awkward lag and timing of virtual conversation, the way humor and nuance got lost in digital translation. May brought the beginning of tentative reopenings in some places, as infection numbers declined and the pressure to restore economic activity grew overwhelming. But the reopenings were complicated by the fact that the virus had not gone away. It had merely been suppressed by the lockdowns, and as soon as restrictions eased and people resumed mixing, transmission began climbing again. It was like trying to negotiate with a force of nature, trying to find some middle ground between complete shutdown and normal life, and the virus kept reminding us that it had no interest in compromise. The summer of 2020 brought additional complications. In the United States, the murder of George Floyd by police sparked protests that spread across the country and around the world. Millions took to the streets despite the pandemic, concluding that racial justice could not wait for a more convenient time, that the brutality captured on video demanded an immediate response. The protests became another dimension of the pandemic's complexity. Public health officials generally supported the cause while worrying about superspreader events. Protesters wore masks and tried to maintain distance while chanting and marching, and the whole situation highlighted the impossible tensions between different urgent priorities. The summer also revealed the long-term impacts of COVID-19 infection. Many people who had supposedly recovered found themselves dealing with persistent symptoms, chronic fatigue, brain fog, breathing difficulties, heart problems that lingered for months. This condition, which came to be known as long COVID, affected even some people who had experienced relatively mild acute infections. It was a reminder that the pandemic's impact extended far beyond the death count, that millions of people would carry the scars of this experience in their bodies for years or perhaps the rest of their lives. By autumn, pandemic fatigue was setting in across much of the world. People were exhausted by the restrictions, the isolation, the uncertainty that seemed to stretch endlessly into the future. The initial solidarity and shared purpose had frayed, replaced by frustration and division. Mask wearing became politicized in some countries, particularly the United States, where something as simple as a piece of cloth over the face became a symbol of broader conflicts about individual liberty versus collective responsibility, about trust and expertise versus suspicion of authority. The election season in the United States unfolded against this backdrop of pandemic and protest and economic devastation. President Trump, who had consistently downplayed the virus's severity and resisted public health measures, contracted COVID-19 himself in October, receiving experimental treatments at Walter Reed Medical Center while continuing to insist that the virus was no serious threat. The election itself became another flashpoint, with massive increases in mail-in voting to avoid in-person crowding, leading to baseless claims of fraud that would ultimately culminate in the January 6 attack on the Capitol. The fall and winter brought a second wave, or depending on how you counted, a continuation of the first wave that had never really ended, with infections surging across Europe and North America as people moved back indoors with colder weather. Hospitals that had barely recovered from the spring surge found themselves overwhelmed again. Healthcare workers who had been hailed as heroes continued working impossible hours for inadequate pay, burning out and breaking down under the relentless stress. But there was also hope. In November, Pfizer and BioNTech announced results from their vaccine trial showing 95% efficacy. Moderna followed with similar results. These mRNA vaccines represented a triumph of modern science. The technology had been developed over decades of basic research. The specific vaccines had been designed within days of the virus's genome being published, and the clinical trials had been conducted with unprecedented speed without sacrificing safety. The decades of investment in basic science, the global cooperation in sharing data, the regulatory systems that found ways to accelerate without cutting corners, all of it came together to produce a medical miracle. The first vaccinations began in December 2020, starting with healthcare workers and nursing home residents, those most at risk and most essential. The images of nurses and doctors rolling up their sleeves to receive the shot, many of them visibly emotional after months of trauma and loss, carried profound symbolic weight. It was the beginning of the end, even though the end was still many months away. The vaccine rollout itself became another complex challenge. There were questions of supply, how to manufacture billions of doses quickly enough, how to distribute them globally when wealthy nations were scrambling to secure supplies for their own populations. There were questions of equity, who would get the vaccine first, how to reach marginalized communities that had been hardest hit but often had the least access to healthcare. There were questions of hesitancy, how to convince people skeptical of vaccines or of government or of pharmaceutical companies that this shot was safe and necessary. The winter of 2020 to 2021 was perhaps the darkest phase of the entire pandemic. Infections reached record levels across much of the northern hemisphere. The United States was losing thousands of people per day, more than died on September 11th, every single day, for weeks on end. Hospitals implemented crisis standards of care, rationing resources, and making impossible triage decisions. Healthcare workers posted increasingly desperate messages about the conditions they were facing, begging people to take the virus seriously, to wear masks and avoid gathering, to do anything to slow the relentless flood of patients. And yet large portions of the population had given up on precautions, exhausted by nearly a year of restrictions, convinced that the risks were overblown or that personal freedom trumped collective safety. The holidays brought gatherings despite public health warnings, and January saw predictable surges as a result of Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations. People were dying in parking lots waiting for hospital beds, dying in hallways because the ICUs were full, dying while their family members remained convinced that COVID was a hoax or no worse than the flu. January 2021 brought a transition of presidential administration in the United States, with Joe Biden inheriting a nation in crisis on multiple fronts. His administration immediately implemented a national COVID-19 strategy, something that had been conspicuously absent under his predecessor. Mass vaccination sites opened across the country. The pace of vaccine administration accelerated from hundreds of thousands per day to millions per day. Supply chain issues were addressed through invocation of the Defense Production Act. International cooperation was restored. As winter gave way to spring in 2021, the vaccines began to show their impact. Cases declined dramatically among vaccinated populations. Hospitalizations and deaths, which lag infections by weeks, began to fall. Healthcare workers who had been living in fear of infection and of transmitting the virus to their families could finally breathe a little easier. The elderly and immunocompromised, who had been essentially confined for over a year, could begin cautiously re-entering the world. But the pandemic was not finished with us. New variants of the virus emerged, each with its own characteristics. The Alpha variant, first identified in the United Kingdom, spread more easily. The Beta and Gamma variants showed some ability to evade immunity from prior infection or vaccination. And Delta, which emerged in India and spread globally in the summer of 2021, combined increased transmissibility with increased severity, causing another surge even in populations with relatively high vaccination rates. India's Delta wave was particularly devastating. The images from April and May 2021, funeral pyres burning by the hundreds in open spaces because crematoriums were overwhelmed, people dying in the streets while searching for oxygen, hospitals running out of supplies, showed that the pandemic retained its capacity to catastrophically overwhelm health systems. The suffering in India also highlighted the global vaccine inequality problem. While wealthy nations were vaccinating their populations and debating whether healthy young people needed shots, much of the world remained unvaccinated and vulnerable. By summer 2021, many wealthy nations were approaching something resembling normalcy. Restaurants reopened, offices called workers back, travel resumed. But the pandemic remained stubbornly present, particularly in areas with lower vaccination rates. The United States became a patchwork of different realities. In areas with high vaccination uptake, life had largely returned to pre-pandemic patterns, while in areas with vaccine resistance, hospitals filled again with COVID patients, almost all of them unvaccinated, many of them expressing shock and regret as they struggled to breathe. The political and social divisions that the pandemic had created or revealed showed no signs of healing. Mask mandates became flashpoints for conflict, with school board meetings devolving into shouting matches, stores having to hire security to enforce requirements, flight attendants facing physical assault from passengers refusing to comply. The phrase, "trust the science," became both a rallying cry and a point of division, with different groups claiming scientific support for contradictory positions. Healthcare workers continued to burn out in alarming numbers. After nearly 2 years of crisis conditions, many were simply done. They left bedside nursing or medicine entirely, unable to sustain the physical and emotional toll, frustrated by the feeling that much of the suffering they were witnessing was now preventable through vaccination but happening anyway because of misinformation and politicization. The Omicron variant, first identified in South Africa in November 2021, brought yet another wave, this time characterized by extreme transmissibility. Omicron spread through populations with stunning speed, causing case numbers to spike to levels that dwarfed previous surges. However, the combination of widespread vaccination and prior infection meant that for many people, Omicron caused relatively mild illness. It was as if the virus was becoming endemic, transitioning from pandemic pathogen to seasonal annoyance, though one that still caused severe disease and death in vulnerable populations. As we moved through 2022, the acute crisis phase of the pandemic began to wind down in most of the world, though with tragic exceptions in China where zero-COVID policies led to extended lockdowns and in regions where vaccine access remained limited. The emergency gradually became something we learned to live with, not quite normal, but a new baseline that incorporated awareness of viral threats, changes in how we work and socialize, and an altered relationship with risk and safety. The 100 days when the world went silent stretched into 2 years, then 3, transforming from acute emergency to chronic condition. But those first months, from late January 2020 when Wuhan locked down through the spring and summer as the pandemic rolled across the globe, those months represented a rupture in human experience unlike anything most of us had witnessed. They were a moment when the comfortable assumptions about progress and control were stripped away, when we were reminded that we remain vulnerable to forces beyond our mastery, when the fragility of our systems and our society was laid bare. What did we learn from this experience? The answers vary depending on whom you ask. Some saw vindication of their pre-existing beliefs about government overreach or scientific hubris or corporate greed or social inequality. Some saw evidence of human resilience and adaptability, our ability to rapidly develop new technologies and adjust our behaviors when necessary. Some saw the importance of international cooperation and robust public health systems. Some saw the danger of misinformation and the fragmentation of shared reality. Perhaps the most fundamental lesson is one about humility. We are, for all our technological achievement and accumulated knowledge, still vulnerable to the ancient threats that have shaped human existence: disease, hunger, fear, isolation. We are still biological creatures subject to the laws of nature, still dependent on cooperation and care to survive, still capable of both extraordinary altruism and shocking selfishness when faced with crisis. The pandemic also taught us something about time and its passing. The lockdown period had a strange quality of temporal distortion, days that felt endless yet weeks that disappeared, months that blurred together in a haze of sameness. Without the usual markers of time's passage, commutes and social gatherings, seasons marked by activities rather than just weather, the rhythm of school years and holidays celebrated in familiar ways, time became elastic and disorienting. People spoke of pandemic time as if it were a different dimension, where March 2020 could feel simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The children who live through this will carry it with them in ways we cannot fully predict. Those who were very young may have no conscious memory of the before times, no recollection of a world where faces were always visible, where proximity was unremarkable, where the baseline assumption was that you could touch and be near anyone you pleased. The developmental impacts of missing social interaction at crucial ages, of absorbing their parents' stress and fear, of learning that the world is a dangerous place requiring constant vigilance, will ripple forward through decades. For adolescents, who lost formative experiences at a stage when peer relationships and independence are so crucial, the scars may be different but equally lasting. The college student who spent freshman year isolated in a dorm room, meeting people only through screens. The high school athlete whose final season was canceled, whose scholarship prospects evaporated. The teenager whose mental health crisis intensified in isolation, without the buffering effect of school and friends and routine. And for adults, particularly those in midlife who lost parents or grandparents to COVID, who couldn't be present for their dying, who missed the chance for final conversations or goodbyes, that grief has a particular quality of incompleteness, of wounds that cannot properly heal because the normal rituals of mourning were denied. The weight of that loss will be carried forward into whatever future we build. The economic transformation may prove as lasting as the public health impact. Remote work, which had been gradually increasing but was still relatively uncommon in many industries, became normalized almost overnight. Companies that had insisted for years that physical presence was essential for productivity discovered that their employees could be just as effective from home. This shift has implications for urban planning, for commercial real estate, for the geography of opportunity, for work-life balance and the boundaries between professional and personal time. Some workers thrived with remote work, the introverts who found relief from office small talk, the parents who gained hours from eliminated commutes, those who could finally live where they wished rather than where their job required. But others struggled with isolation, with the loss of boundaries between work and home, with the challenge of building relationships and mentoring and collaborating through screens. And many, particularly those in service industries that cannot be done remotely, watched with some bitterness as others worked safely from home while they continued to risk exposure for lower wages. The retail apocalypse that had been gradually unfolding for years accelerated dramatically. Stores that had been barely hanging on closed permanently. Shopping habits shifted more decisively toward e-commerce, with all the implications that carries for local communities, for spontaneous encounters and browsing and the social function that retail spaces serve. The rise of delivery services, for groceries, for restaurant food, for anything you might need, created a new service class of gig workers bearing the risk and receiving few protections. Education systems were forced to innovate, and not all the changes were negative. Many students thrived with online learning, appreciating the flexibility and the ability to review recorded lectures. Teachers developed new skills and discovered new tools. The forced experimentation with educational technology will likely yield long-term benefits, even as we acknowledge the costs of the disruption. But the educational losses, particularly for disadvantaged students, were real and substantial. Children who spent months or years in remote learning fell behind academically, especially in early grades where foundational skills are built. The gap between wealthy students with resources and support at home and poor students without reliable internet or quiet study spaces or engaged parents widened dramatically. The long-term economic impacts of this learning loss will persist for decades as these students enter the workforce with weaker preparation. The healthcare system learned painful lessons about surge capacity and supply chains, about the importance of stockpiling PPE and maintaining manufacturing capability for essential supplies domestically rather than depending on global networks that can be disrupted. Hospitals developed better protocols for treating COVID-19 specifically and for managing respiratory viral diseases generally. The accelerated adoption of telemedicine made healthcare more accessible for some patients while highlighting digital divides and the limitations of remote care for others. The scientific community demonstrated both remarkable capability and frustrating limitations. The speed with which vaccines were developed was genuinely extraordinary, a triumph of modern molecular biology and global cooperation. The sharing of genomic data, the parallel development of multiple vaccine approaches, the regulatory innovations that allowed accelerated timelines without sacrificing safety, all of this showed science at its best. But science communication proved more challenging. The public, understandably, wanted certainty and simple answers. Scientists, equally understandably, had to communicate evolving understanding as new data emerged. The result was often confusion and the perception of mixed messages. When guidance changed, about masks, about outdoor transmission, about the need for boosters, it was evidence of the scientific process working as designed, updating recommendations based on new information. But for many, it looked like experts who didn't know what they were talking about, feeding skepticism and conspiracy theories. The infodemic, the avalanche of misinformation and disinformation that spread alongside the biological pandemic, proved in some ways as challenging as the virus itself. Social media platforms struggled to balance free speech with public health, to moderate content that was false or harmful without appearing to censor legitimate debate. Conspiracy theories flourished, claims that the virus was bioengineered or that vaccines contained tracking chips or that the whole pandemic was a hoax to enable government control. Some of this was deliberately spread by bad actors seeking to sow discord or profit from confusion. But much of it arose organically from fear and the human need to find patterns and explanations, even when reality is simply chaotic and frightening. When faced with a threat we cannot control, when expert guidance seems contradictory or incomplete, when institutions prove fallible, conspiracy theories offer the comfort of a comprehensible narrative where everything happens for a reason and villains can be identified and opposed. The political polarization around pandemic response, particularly severe in the United States, revealed deep fractures in how different groups understand risk, authority, community, and individual liberty. For some, masking and vaccination and social distancing were obvious necessities, minor inconveniences gladly accepted to protect vulnerable community members. For others, they represented unacceptable infringements on personal freedom, evidence of government overreach and the tyranny of experts who didn't understand real people's lives. These were not merely disagreements about facts, they reflected fundamentally different worldviews about the proper relationship between individual and collective, about whose voices deserve authority, about whether we are primarily responsible for ourselves or for each other. The pandemic didn't create these divisions, but it brought them into sharp focus and gave them immediate, life and death stakes. The global dimensions of the pandemic highlighted both our interconnectedness and our inequalities. A virus that emerged in one region spread everywhere within weeks, demonstrating that in our globally connected world, disease anywhere is potentially disease everywhere. But the response and resources available varied dramatically. Wealthy nations could afford lockdowns with economic support, massive healthcare interventions, vaccine development, and purchases. Poor nations had to choose between pandemic control and economic catastrophe, often facing impossible dilemmas with inadequate resources. The vaccine inequality was particularly stark. While wealthy nations were offering third and fourth booster shots to their entire populations, many poor nations struggled to vaccinate their most vulnerable. The hoarding of vaccine supplies by rich countries, while understandable from a narrow national self-interest perspective, was both morally troubling and pragmatically foolish. Allowing the virus to circulate freely in unvaccinated populations created opportunities for new variants to emerge, variants that could then spread globally and potentially evade vaccine-induced immunity. There were calls for vaccine patents to be waived, for technology transfer to allow local production in more countries, for a truly global response to a global problem. Some progress was made, but not nearly enough, and the nationalism that marked the vaccine rollout will stand as one of the pandemic's moral failures, a reminder that our rhetoric about global solidarity often fails when tested by actual crisis. Climate change emerged as an unexpected thread in the pandemic narrative. The lockdowns dramatically reduced economic activity and transportation, leading to sharp decreases in air pollution and carbon emissions. The images of clear skies over normally smoggy cities, of wildlife reclaiming spaces usually dominated by humans, sparked conversations about whether we could maintain some of these environmental improvements. But as economies reopened, emissions largely rebounded, suggesting that temporary disruptions are no substitute for structural changes to how we produce and consume energy. The pandemic also provided an unexpected preview of the kinds of disruptions that climate change will bring: supply chain disruptions, mass migrations, competition for scarce resources, unequal impacts that fall hardest on the vulnerable, the challenge of coordinating global responses to threats that don't respect borders. In that sense, COVID-19 might be understood as practice for the larger and longer crisis of environmental change, though whether we learned the right lessons remains to be seen. The mental health impacts of the pandemic will likely be with us for a generation. The trauma was collective but also deeply individual: the healthcare worker who held dying patients' hands when family couldn't be present, the COVID long hauler struggling with symptoms that don't resolve and doctors who don't fully understand, the child who missed crucial developmental experiences, the person who lost a business built over decades, the family that lost multiple members in quick succession. Some found unexpected resilience, discovering strengths they didn't know they possessed, building new communities and connections, finding meaning in adversity. But for many others, the pandemic broke something that will be difficult to repair: trust in institutions, optimism about the future, the sense of safety and security that allows us to move through the world without hypervigilance, the assumption that tomorrow will basically resemble today. Anxiety disorders, depression, substance abuse, PTSD, all increased during the pandemic years. Children's hospitals reported surges in eating disorders and suicide attempts. Adults who had never experienced mental health challenges found themselves struggling. The mental health system, already inadequate before 2020, was overwhelmed by need at exactly the moment when it was most difficult to deliver services safely. The pandemic also affected our relationship with death itself. In normal times, death in wealthy nations is largely invisible. It happens in hospitals or nursing homes, managed by professionals, removed from everyday life. But the pandemic brought death back into public consciousness in a way that felt medieval. The daily death counts reported on the news, the refrigerated trucks serving as overflow morgues, the mass graves dug on Hart Island in New York, death was suddenly visible and omnipresent. This visibility had complex effects. For some, it deepened appreciation for life and relationships, sparked conversations about mortality and meaning that our culture typically avoids. For others, it was traumatizing, overwhelming, a flood of grief that exceeded our capacity to process. And for still others, it led to a kind of numbing, where the numbers became so large that they ceased to carry emotional weight, compassion fatigue on a societal scale. The 100 days of silence stretched into months and years, but if we're honest, the world never truly went silent. It was quieter in some ways: less traffic noise, fewer airplanes overhead, the absence of crowds and their ambient hum. But in other ways it grew louder: the sound of ambulance sirens at all hours, the ventilators breathing for those who couldn't breathe for themselves, the arguments and fear and grief amplified by uncertainty. And beneath it all, the silence of absence. The empty chair at the holiday table. The phone that won't ring again with that particular voice. The business that closed its doors forever. The dreams deferred or abandoned. The version of ourselves we might have become in a world where 2020 unfolded differently. That silence echoes still, a frequency just below hearing but always present, a reminder of what was lost and cannot be recovered. As we move through 2022 and into 2023, the acute phase of the pandemic transitioned into something more ambiguous and harder to define. COVID-19 became endemic rather than pandemic, still circulating, still causing illness and death, but at levels that society decided it could tolerate as part of the background noise of existence. The emergency declarations were lifted. The daily case counts largely stopped being reported. Life resumed patterns that resembled the before times, though never quite identical. Masks largely disappeared from public spaces in many countries, though some people continued wearing them, sometimes from continued concern about infection, sometimes from immunocompromise or care for vulnerable family members, sometimes from having grown comfortable with the anonymity and personal space that masks provided. The sight of someone masked no longer carried much meaning, it was just part of the landscape of choice, one of many ways people navigated risk differently. The booster campaigns continued, with updated vaccines targeting new variants, though uptake was lower than for initial doses. People grew tired of shots, uncertain whether they were necessary, falling back into old assumptions that we didn't need to think about disease prevention. The public health messaging grew more muted, less urgent, acknowledging perhaps that constant alarm bells eventually become background noise that people tune out. Long COVID remained a significant concern, affecting millions of people worldwide with symptoms that persisted months or years after initial infection: crushing fatigue, brain fog, breathing difficulties, rapid heartbeat, a constellation of problems that seemed to affect nearly every body system. The mechanisms weren't fully understood, the treatments were largely experimental or supportive, and many physicians remained skeptical about whether it was a distinct condition or a collection of other problems. For those living with long COVID, that skepticism was maddening and isolating. They had blood tests that came back normal, scans that showed nothing wrong, doctors who suggested their symptoms might be psychosomatic or due to anxiety or deconditioning. But they knew their own bodies, knew something fundamental had changed, knew that the person they were before infection was not the person they were now. The disability, often invisible to others, limited work and relationships and simple daily activities in ways that were hard to explain to those who hadn't experienced it. Others watched as businesses closed and tax revenues declined and the vibrancy drained from once bustling districts. The travel and tourism industry slowly recovered, though changed in various ways. Business travel, which had been a major revenue source for airlines and hotels, remained depressed as companies discovered that many trips weren't actually necessary. Cruise ships, which had been vectors for early outbreaks and had suffered enormous reputational damage, worked to rebuild trust with enhanced health protocols. Tourism to urban destinations rebounded, but with different patterns, different mixes of domestic and international visitors, different balances between luxury and budget travel. The restaurant industry, which had been devastated by lockdowns and capacity restrictions, came back transformed. Ghost kitchens, commercial cooking facilities that produced food only for delivery, with no dine-in option, proliferated. Outdoor dining expanded in cities that changed regulations to allow it. The labor shortage meant many restaurants operated with reduced hours or service levels. Menu prices rose to cover increased costs. Some of the neighborhood places that had been gathering spots for years or decades never reopened, leaving holes in the social fabric that new establishments couldn't quite fill. Arts and culture faced particularly difficult recovery. Many performing arts organizations had lost a year or more of revenue, depleted reserves, seen donors reduce giving and subscribers not renew. When venues reopened, audiences were slow to return, some still concerned about indoor crowds, some having fallen out of the habit of attending live performances, some having shifted their entertainment spending toward home streaming services. Smaller and mid-sized organizations, lacking the endowments and donor bases of major institutions, closed in disturbing numbers. Museums and galleries reopened to reduced capacity and changed behaviors. Timed ticketing, one-way routes through exhibitions, no interactive elements that multiple people might touch. The spontaneous gallery browsing, the ability to spend as long as you wished with a particular work or to return multiple times, was constrained by reservation systems and capacity limits. Art, which depends on gathering and shared experience, had to find ways to maintain meaning and impact while managing the logistics of disease prevention. The faith communities that had sustained so many people through difficult times found themselves grappling with new realities. Online services, initially embraced as a necessity, persisted as an option that some congregants preferred, the convenience of worship from home, the ability to connect with communities beyond geographical boundaries. But something was lost in translation, the sense of gathered community, the physical rituals of communion or prayer, the informal social connections that happen before and after formal services. Many religious leaders worried about fragmentation, about the loss of physical community even as digital connection increased. Some churches never reopened, their congregations having scattered during the lockdowns and not returned. Others found new vitality, particularly those that had embraced social justice causes or that served communities hit particularly hard by the pandemic, offering not just spiritual support but practical mutual aid and advocacy. The schools that reopened faced complex challenges. Teachers were exhausted, having carried impossible burdens during remote learning and now dealing with students who had fallen behind academically and who brought pandemic trauma into classrooms. Behavior problems increased, particularly among younger children who had missed crucial periods for learning social skills and emotional regulation. School counselors were overwhelmed by demand for mental health support. Chronic absenteeism rose as attendance habits established during remote learning persisted. But there were also innovations worth preserving, flexible learning options for students who thrived with independence, better integration of technology, increased attention to social-emotional learning, stronger connections between schools and families who had worked together during remote learning. The challenge was distinguishing temporary crisis responses from changes that should be permanent improvements, and finding resources to sustain innovations while also addressing learning loss and trauma. Universities and colleges faced their own reckonings. Enrollment declined, particularly at non-elite institutions and in programs that didn't lead clearly to careers. Students and families questioned the value proposition of expensive tuition for online classes delivered from dorm rooms. International enrollment dropped due to travel restrictions and visa complications and concerns about safety. The financial stress accelerated existing trends toward adjunctification of faculty, toward prioritizing profitable programs over liberal arts, toward treating education as a consumer product rather than a public good. The pandemic years also saw significant changes in where people lived. Released from the need to commute to offices daily, some workers left expensive cities for smaller towns or rural areas where housing was affordable and space was available. This migration had complex effects, bringing economic vitality and rising housing prices to areas that had been declining, but also creating tensions between longtime residents and newcomers with different values and expectations. Cities meanwhile struggled with the loss of tax-paying residents even as they faced increased need for services. The climate change connection became more apparent as the pandemic waned. The temporary emissions reduction had been reversed, but attention to environmental issues had, if anything, intensified. Climate disasters increased in frequency and severity, wildfires in the American West and Mediterranean regions, flooding in Germany and China, heat waves that killed thousands. The pandemic had shown that humanity could mobilize rapidly when faced with existential threat, raising the question of why we weren't doing so for the larger and ultimately more dangerous threat of environmental collapse. Some drew optimism from the pandemic response, seeing proof that rapid technological innovation and behavior change were possible when necessity demanded them. Others drew pessimism, noting that the mobilization had been incomplete and fractured, that many people resisted even minor impositions on their liberty for the common good, that international cooperation had been limited and nationalistic impulses strong. If we struggled this much with a pandemic that had clear cause and effect and a path to resolution, how would we handle the slower-moving, more complex crisis of climate change? The geopolitical implications of the pandemic continued unfolding. China's initial handling of the outbreak, and questions about transparency and information sharing, damaged its international reputation and fueled tensions with the United States and other nations. The uneven distribution of vaccines reflected and reinforced global power dynamics. The economic disruptions and supply chain problems prompted many countries to reconsider globalization and economic interdependence, moving toward more localized production and reduced reliance on complex international networks. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, while not directly caused by the pandemic, occurred against a backdrop of pandemic disruption and distraction. The war created new humanitarian crises and economic shocks, energy prices spiking, food supplies disrupted, refugees fleeing, that hit populations already exhausted and strained by years of pandemic stress. It was a reminder that the pandemic was not the only crisis humanity faced, that history hadn't paused during COVID-19, that other threats and conflicts continued to unfold. By late 2022 and early 2023, most countries had essentially declared the pandemic over, even though the virus continued circulating and evolving. The World Health Organization maintained that COVID-19 remained a public health emergency, but individual nations were done with emergency measures and ready to move on. The gap between official emergency status and actual behavior grew wider, reflecting a kind of collective decision that we would accept ongoing illness and death at levels that would have seemed unthinkable in 2019. This acceptance was partly rational calculation. The vaccines had dramatically reduced severe disease and death even if they didn't prevent infection entirely. Most people had now been infected and developed some immunity. The virus itself had evolved toward forms that were generally less severe. But it was also exhaustion and willful forgetting, a desire to return to normal that outweighed concerns about continued risk, an implicit decision that the costs of ongoing precautions exceeded their benefits. The official end of the public health emergency in the United States came in May 2023, when the Biden administration lifted the emergency declaration that had been in place for over 3 years. The move was largely symbolic. By that point, few restrictions remained and most people were living as if the pandemic had ended. But it marked a formal transition, a signal that the extraordinary period was over and we were returning to ordinary governance of a disease that would remain with us but would Northwest longer drive policy and resource allocation. Yet the pandemic's shadow lingered in countless ways. The million-plus Americans who had died left behind grief that would never fully heal. The millions dealing with long COVID faced uncertain futures with limited medical understanding or support. The children whose educations had been disrupted carried that learning loss forward. The healthcare workers who had burned out left gaps in an already strained system. The trust that had been broken, in institutions, in expertise, in each other, would not easily be restored. We are, all of us who lived through this, changed by it in ways both obvious and subtle. We are more aware of our own mortality and vulnerability, having seen how quickly the unthinkable can become reality. We are more attuned to trade-offs between safety and freedom, between individual choice and collective good, having debated these questions at the most fundamental level. We are more conscious of inequality in who bears risk for whose benefit, having watched those patterns play out with stark clarity. Some of us emerged from the pandemic more generous, more community-oriented, more appreciative of human connection and physical presence. Others emerged more isolated, more cynical, more convinced that institutions cannot be trusted and everyone must look out primarily for themselves. Most of us carry both tendencies, contradictory lessons drawn from contradictory experiences, still trying to integrate what happened into our understanding of the world and our place in it. The story of COVID-19 is still being written, still unfolding in ways we cannot fully predict. The virus continues to evolve, to find new hosts, to test the immunity we've built through vaccination and prior infection. We continue to learn about its long-term health effects, about the ways it changed our bodies and our societies. We continue to debate what we did right and wrong, what we should do differently if faced with another pandemic, how to build systems more resilient to the disruptions that will certainly come. But the 100 days when the world went silent. Those strange, suspended months in the spring and summer of 2020 when human activity paused in ways that seemed impossible, those days are over. The great pause ended, the restart happened, life resumed even if it never quite returned to what it was. We carry forward the memories and the losses, the lessons and the trauma, the temporary changes that became permanent and the intended improvements that faded when urgency waned. What will future generations make of this time? How will historians, with the perspective of decades or centuries, interpret what we lived through? Will they see it as a turning point that changed the trajectory of human civilization, or as a temporary disruption from which we quickly recovered? Will they view our response as evidence of humanity's resilience and ingenuity, or of our tribalism and inability to cooperate in the face of collective threat? Perhaps they will see it as all of these things simultaneously, because that is what it was, humanity at its best and worst, our capacity for both great sacrifice and great selfishness, our impressive technological capabilities coupled with our frustrating inability to deploy them equitably, our longing for connection conflicting with our fears and suspicions. We were, in short, ourselves, flawed and striving, mortal and meaning-seeking, capable of adapting to extraordinary circumstances while carrying forward all our ordinary human characteristics. The pandemic showed us that we are vulnerable in ways we had forgotten, that progress is not inexorable, that the comfortable assumptions of modernity can be stripped away in weeks, revealing how thin the veneer of civilization really is. But it also showed us capacity for rapid innovation, for adapting behaviors when necessary, for caring for strangers and sacrificing for the vulnerable, for finding meaning and connection even in isolation. We learned that we can change our societies dramatically and quickly when we choose to, that work and education and healthcare can be delivered in different ways than we had thought possible, that many, this is just how things are done, assumptions were actually choices that could be made differently. The question is whether we will carry forward that knowledge and use it to address other challenges, or whether we will slip back into old patterns, treating the pandemic as an exceptional disruption rather than as information about what is possible. We learned about our supply chains and their fragility, about the importance of slack and redundancy in systems we had optimized for efficiency without considering resilience. We learned about inequality and how crisis amplifies existing disparities, about whose lives are considered essential and whose are treated as disposable. We learned about science communication and public health messaging, about the challenges of translating complex evolving understanding into clear actionable guidance for diverse populations. We learned about governance and federalism, about the importance of institutions and their limitations, about how political polarization can make even practical public health measures contentious, about the ways that misinformation spreads and how difficult it is to counter. We learned about our own risk tolerances and values, about what we're willing to sacrifice for safety versus freedom, for others versus ourselves, for the short term versus the long term. And perhaps most fundamentally, we learned about our interdependence. The pandemic made visceral what had been abstract, that we are connected to everyone else on this planet, that disease anywhere can become disease everywhere, that my breathing near you could kill you or you could kill me, that we require each other's cooperation to survive. This realization was both frightening and potentially transformative, a reminder that we truly are in this together whether we like it or not. Close your eyes now and let yourself remember those early days, when the world was new and strange and frightening in ways we couldn't quite articulate. Remember the uncertainty of not knowing what would happen next, the surreal quality of empty streets and closed businesses and faces hidden behind masks. Remember the fear and the boredom and the way time seemed to fold in on itself. Remember the loss and the loneliness and the small acts of kindness that sustained us. Remember the exhaustion and the rage and the moments of unexpected grace. Hold those memories gently, for they are part of who we are now, part of the story we will tell about ourselves in this era. We are the people who lived through the pandemic, who survived or didn't survive, who helped each other or turned away, who learned and grew or hardened and closed off. We are marked by this experience in ways that will ripple forward through the rest of our lives and into the lives of those who come after us. The 100 days when the world went silent have passed, but their echoes remain. In the empty storefronts that never reopened, in the career changes and relocations and relationships formed or ended during lockdown, in the children growing up in the shadow of masks and distance, in the collective trauma we carry and are only beginning to process. The silence is broken now, the noise of normal life has returned, but underneath it, if you listen carefully, you can still hear that eerie quiet, that suspended moment when history paused and held its breath. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that we should listen to that silence, should remember what it taught us, should use the knowledge we gained to build a different future. The pandemic showed us cracks in our systems and our societies, showed us where we are vulnerable and where we need to be stronger. It showed us what matters and what is superficial, what we miss when it's taken away and what we don't. It showed us both the depth of human suffering and the height of human courage. We cannot return to what was, because we are not who we were. We have been changed by loss and fear and isolation, but also by resilience and adaptation and the discovery of strength we didn't know we possessed. We have learned what it means to sacrifice for others, to accept risk for the common good, to find connection despite distance. We have learned the value of what we took for granted, human touch, gathered community, the simple freedom to move through the world without fear. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let yourself rest in the knowledge that you survived, that we collectively survived, one of the most challenging periods in modern history. Let yourself feel grateful for whatever blessings you have, health, connection, shelter, sustenance. Let yourself feel compassion for those who suffered more than you did, who lost what cannot be replaced, who carry burdens that will not be put down. And let yourself hope, not naively but realistically, that we can be wise enough to learn from what we've been through, brave enough to make the changes that need to be made, compassionate enough to build a world that protects its most vulnerable, connected enough to remember that we rise or fall together. The pandemic was a test we didn't ask for, and our performance was mixed, some moments of inspiring nobility and other moments of shameful selfishness. But we're still here, still capable of growth and change, still writing the story of who we will become. The world that went silent has found its voice again, though it speaks with a different accent now, shaped by everything we've been through. The 100 days stretched into 1,000, and the 1,000 days will stretch into memory, fading in specificity as all things do, leaving behind only the essence of what we learned and who we became. But for this moment, here in this quiet space between waking and sleeping, between remembering and forgetting, between what was and what will be, we can hold it all. The pain and the beauty, the loss and the resilience, the ending and the beginning. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this story, that your life and choices and experiences during these extraordinary years matter, that you contributed to the collective human response to challenge even if you never felt particularly heroic. Rest in the understanding that trauma takes time to process, that healing is not linear, that it's okay to still be affected by what you've been through. Rest in the hope that we can use what we've learned to build something better, something more resilient and equitable and human. The 100 days when the world went silent are over, but their lessons remain, written in our bodies and our societies, in the spaces where people used to be and aren't anymore, in the changes we made and kept and the ones we let slip away. Listen to that silence when you can, let it teach you what it has to teach, let it remind you of what matters and what doesn't, of your own fragility and your surprising strength, of your connection to everyone else trying to make sense of this strange and precious life. Sleep now, dear friend, and let the story settle into your dreams, where it belongs, where all the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we've survived eventually find their home. Sleep with the knowledge that tomorrow awaits, that the world continues turning, that we carry forward both the weight of what we've lost and the lightness of having survived, both the scars and the wisdom, both the grief and the gratitude. Sleep in the understanding that you are not alone in this, that we are all trying to make sense of what happened, all trying to integrate the pandemic years into the larger story of our lives. And as you drift away into that quiet place between consciousness and sleep, know that the 100 days are over, but their meaning continues to unfold, that we are still discovering what they taught us, still becoming the people we will be because of what we endured. The silence has ended, but its echo remains, a reminder of the moment when everything stopped and we had to remember what truly mattered, when we had to choose what kind of people we would be in the face of collective crisis, when we learned that we are more vulnerable and more resilient than we knew. Rest now in that knowledge, in the peace of survival, in the gentle company of this shared story that belongs to all of us who lived through those impossible days when the world went silent and then, slowly, stubbornly, courageously, found its voice again and continued on, carrying its losses and its lessons forward into whatever comes next, into the future that is always arriving, always unfolding, always asking us to be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more aware of how precious and fragile and interconnected everything is. Good night, dear friend. May your dreams be gentle, your rest be deep, and your tomorrow be bright with the light of all you've learned and all you've survived and all the love that sustained you through the 100 days and beyond, into this moment and the next and all the moments still to come in this strange and beautiful journey we share.